Charges were announced against Alec Baldwin for his involvement in the accidental discharge of a firearm while filming a movie in New Mexico back in October 21st, 2021. A quick refresher on what's going on. Alec Baldwin was rehearsing a scene for a film when a firearm specialist handed him a real firearm that was supposed to be unloaded. Alec Baldwin did not independently verify the firearm was unloaded. While rehearsing, Alec Baldwin then points the firearm at the film's cinematographer. The firearm discharges and the cinematographer tragically passes away. And now, 15 months later, the prosecutors in New Mexico announced that Alec Baldwin will be facing charges of involuntary manslaughter for his role in the death of the cinematographer. What does New Mexico consider involuntary manslaughter? I am not a licensed attorney in New Mexico, but I was able to research what New Mexico considers involuntary manslaughter. Now here's the statute. Involuntary manslaughter consists of manslaughter committed in the commission of an unlawful act not amounting to a felony or in the commission of a lawful act which might produce death in an unlawful manner or without due caution and circumspection. That's a lot of words. It looks like this involuntary manslaughter statute has two separate ways a person can be found guilty of involuntary manslaughter in New Mexico. Number one, the prosecutors can show that it was unlawful to ever point a firearm at a person. Or number two, the prosecutors can show that even if it was legal to point a firearm at a person on a movie set, the way Alec Baldwin did it was without due caution or in an unlawful manner. All that sounds like negligence to me. Both ways basically allege Alec Baldwin should have personally made sure the firearm was not loaded before using it in rehearsal. Involuntary manslaughter in New Mexico does not require a prosecutor prove that Alec Baldwin intended for anyone to be hurt. If convicted, Alec Baldwin faces 18 months in jail, and apparently there is a firearm enhancement which would bring on another 5 years in jail. So that is all about New Mexico. Now, what charges would Alec Baldwin be facing if this had happened in Indiana? Indiana does have an involuntary manslaughter statute, but it doesn't really fit with what Alec Baldwin is alleged to have done. Let's take a look at Indiana's involuntary manslaughter statute. To be found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, a person basically has to be committing a low-level crime that somehow results in another person's death. Example, two people start yelling at each other, and one person decides to push the other one. Nothing too violent, not a punch, just a little push. But the pushed person loses his balance, falls, hits his head, and passes away. Involuntary manslaughter in Indiana requires death and a low-level crime, in this case, battery. Battery is defined as a rude, insolent, or angry touching, and that's what the push was. So even though the pusher did not intend for the death, it's still involuntary manslaughter under Indiana law. Indiana's requirement of a low-level crime is the exact reason why Alec Baldwin wouldn't be facing charges for involuntary manslaughter if the accidental shooting took place in Indiana. I have seen no evidence that New Mexico believes Alec Baldwin was committing a low-level crime when the accidental shooting took place. So even though Alec Baldwin's actions would not be considered involuntary manslaughter in Indiana, that does not mean Alec Baldwin would be off the hook. Indiana does have a statute that goes by another name that looks suspiciously like New Mexico's involuntary manslaughter statute. And here is New Mexico's involuntary manslaughter statute. And here is Indiana's reckless homicide statute. New Mexico's statute is super wordy, but they basically are saying the same thing, especially when you consider how Indiana defines a recklessness. A person engages in conduct recklessly if he engages in the conduct in plain, conscious, and unjustifiable disregard of harm that might result, and the disregard involves a substantial deviation from acceptable standards of conduct. Again, that sounds an awful lot like negligence. In Indiana, prior cases have determined that not checking to see if a firearm was unloaded before pointing that firearm was indeed reckless behavior, which is exactly what Alec Baldwin did in the movie rehearsal. Indiana's reckless homicide statute, just like New Mexico's involuntary manslaughter statute, does not require the state prove that Alec Baldwin meant to cause the passing of the cinematographer. The big difference between New Mexico's involuntary manslaughter statute and Indiana's reckless homicide statute appears to be the punishment. New Mexico's maximum punishment is 18 months. Same crime in Indiana is punishable up to 6 years in jail. That's a pretty big difference. The whole thing is terrible and sad. If this case goes to trial, it's going to come down to whether or not a jury believes it was reasonable for Alec Baldwin to take the word of the firearm specialist and that the firearm was unloaded. Prosecutors in New Mexico will say that Alec Baldwin should have independently checked the firearm, and Alec Baldwin's team will have witnesses testify that it is the industry norm that when a firearm specialist hands an actor a firearm, that actor can rely on the firearm specialist's statements. I have no idea what's going to happen in this case, but my money is on that this messy case is going to get worked out with some sort of plea with Alec Baldwin on probation. And as a side note, Alec Baldwin has made an undisclosed settlement to the family of the cinematographer, and he did that before he knew charges were officially filed. So in closing, please subscribe and leave me a comment with what you think about this. If you disagree, please let me know. And remember, this is America. A suspect is innocent unless and until proven guilty. And lastly, always plead the fifth.